This is Melissa. It is the 11th day of January, 2026, and hard for me to believe that I am closer to the middle of the month than the first of the month, but that is true. And so, first off, Happy New Year. I hope that you are all doing well. I am doing well for the most part. I have a lot of things going on that are exciting to me, projects at stages where it's just fun to be working on them. I was up late a couple of nights last week working on the books with Derek and Ula, and that's getting closer, closing in on that. So just, say overall, it's very good here. I do have that looming end of the month thing, and I will just say that your support is critical. So helpful. Those of you who do support and I haven't been in contact or thanked you, my sincere apologies. I am doing my best as the year starts off to try to catch up and get on top of that. But near the beginning of the talk that I'm putting up today from Alan Watt, he said, for those who don't have my books yet, you can order, and then he tells you to go to www.cuttingthroughthematrix.com, and you can also donate, and that keeps me going. And I know things are getting tight out there. I've talked to a lot of folks, and so you'll hear that in a second. I'm just saying that is the way that it is here for me. I have my overhead and the websites and the things that I do to keep this going, and then, the roof over the head. So that there is out of the way, and I do really appreciate your support. It's necessary. So the talk I chose to go up came right out of what was going on in Venezuela, this going down to Caracas and kidnapping the president of Venezuela, and bringing him back and putting him in Guantanamo, and then saying, we're taking over the oil. And I'm like, okay, I've heard about this before. And so I went looking in Alan's talks for when he discussed the CIA going down and taking over to Guatemala and taking over, basically the overthrow of an elected president to take over a country on behalf of a private company called United Fruit Company. And this was the public relations, all of the lead up, all of the press lead up was orchestrated by Edward Bernays. So I'm like, well, what did Alan have to say about Guatemala? Searched through that, and I found this talk from January 12, 2009. The mass is easy prey for men like Edward Bernays. That was the title in the poem that goes along with it. From standardized consumer directed by stealth, guided into the century of the self. Items which lasted, now gone, oh dismay, thanks to Lehman Brothers and Edward Bernays. Advisor to leaders, this man with babble had secret training in managing rabble. Planned obsolescence became the rule. New is better, the object to fool unconscious desires. You deserve it. Throw old away. No need to preserve it. This Sigmund's nephew knew the game. Treat people as fools, all the same. Fooled a nation to war under Red Scare pretense. Died rich in old age, no trace of repentance. So this is an excellent talk, and I was thinking about Alan and all of his excellent talks. No whistles, no bells, no forecasting, no gimmicks, no predicting the future because you know this, that, or the other. It's just a slow, steady presentation of history that he gives us with a lot of insights and profound wisdom. That's Alan. He tells us, and I have reminded us recently, to watch a documentary, 4-part documentary series called Century of the Self. by Adam Curtis. And I must have mentioned this to you recently because as I was listening to this, I thought, well, I'll just go listen. I'll watch that again. I should watch that again. And so I found it on YouTube and I started to watch it and I'm like, oh, I've saw this not long. It was probably a year and a half ago that I mentioned it. And as I was watching it, I'm 2 hours into the 4-part. I thought this should really be something that we return to on a regular basis, once a year, once every 18 months, because it helps. It's not perfect, and Alan mentions that it's not a perfect documentary, but it helps us to see clearly by the way in which Adam Curtis shows this footage and introduces us to Edward Bernays, who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who I believe coined the term public relations. There were other people who were working in that area at that time, but propaganda got a bad name during World War I. And so and you'll hear this if you watch or listen to Century of the Self, asked himself the question, can propaganda, which is so effective in wartime, can that be used in peacetime for, peaceful ends, like making a lot of money for people? And sure enough, he was very effective at doing that. So you'll hear Alan talk about that and a lot more. But because the perception, we've got the feeling right now that there's a lot going on. And as it turns out, I'm more or less focused on the U.S. today and the few things that I'll say upcoming. But wherever you are, I'm guessing that you too have a perception that a lot has been crammed into the last few days or week and a half's news cycles. So I wanted to mention that this afternoon, because I'm recording this close to midnight on Saturday night, this afternoon starting in the morning, had the CTTM book club where we have been discussing Waiting for the Miracle, the conversations between Alan and Jackie Petru. And we did something a little bit different today, and it was a very good, a long and engaging and stimulating and interesting conversation, as I think they all are. And I hesitate to tell you how long this lasted, just in case any of you have been thinking of going over to Telegram and joining the book club. But at about 7 hours into this conversation that started at 10 a.m. this morning, I thought, I need to walk. I need to stretch my legs and go on a walk. So I've still got, now I've gotten off the computer and I'm now using my phone, and I go knock on my brother's door. Do you want to go for a walk? And it's cold and windy outside, but he agreed. So I told him, when he came downstairs, I said, I've still got book club, so I'm listening to that. So we walked without talking as I was listening to book club. And I was aware that I was crossing the street and I was looking both ways, but there was one point I noticed we had gone up the university campus and then we were crossing the road, and I'm always the pace setter, but I think I was lagging behind and a few paces behind my brother, and he turned around to make sure I was still okay. So we returned home from that. I think that it was about 3/4 of the way through that walk that we decided to end the conversation. There were a couple of people in different parts of the world. I think South Africa had to go to bed, and Germany went to bed, and some people in the UK went to bed. So I'm like, okay, let's call it a night. And then my brother and I started talking, and before we know it, we're home. Later on, as I'm looking through the news and thinking about everything that's going on, which just seems so crazy and intense, my brother came to the door of my little office here and knocked on it, and he said, "Hey, there was a bomb threat at the church. That's why there were all those cop cars there." And I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, remember when we walked by the church, there were all those cop cars there with lights." Well, I hadn't seen it. He hadn't pointed it out to me because I was listening to book club. And I said, "Oh, I guess I was still listening to book club." And I didn't notice it. I was just kind of single-mindedly, walking. And he said, "Yeah, when we passed by the church, there were about 5 cop cars, a couple of lights going, and it, I didn't know what was going on. I didn't point it out to you, but yeah, I thought you might have noticed." Like, the SWAT teams. There weren't SWAT teams, but anyway, he said, yeah, so he was looking at that online, and I said, "Well, is this part of the ICE protests?" And he said, "No, they're not saying what it's about, but as much as they're saying there was a bomb threat at the church." So the ICE protests are because there was a woman killed a few days ago in Minneapolis, and she was killed by ICE, and that is the U.S. I don't even know what the acronym stands for. This is sad, but it's Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Okay, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement is ICE, and that Trump sent them into Minnesota because of the Somali fraud, the daycare fraud related to the Somalis. And Trump said, "Okay, I'm sending in ICE." And there was some Homeland Security there too, I believe. So that was just happening this week. And in the course of one of their operations, a woman and her wife were in an SUV type vehicle, and ICE pulled them over. And the one of the women got out of the car and was pointing out the tags and said, "We don't change them every day." So there was this exchange, and the story, as far as I've gotten it, is that this couple went down to where there was some kind of an ICE raid, and it was said that they were supporting their friends and neighbors, and they were definitely in the area where all of this activity was going on. Now, I read something from Paul Craig Roberts, who Alan has read quite a bit of Paul Craig Roberts over the years. And he's got I'll just put this up so you can, if you're interested, you can get this, the true story of the ICE shooting in Minneapolis. And so what he is presenting, and again, you're going to get if you look into the story at all, or if you're following it all, you're going to have a lot of left, right, left versus right. And so what Paul Craig Roberts is saying is, you've got a Democrat governor, you've got a Democrat mayor, Jacob Fry, and you've got the Democrat representative, Ilhan Omar. Tim Walz is the governor, and they are portraying the deportation of illegals as white supremacist racism. And what he says is, who's to blame here are these elected officials who did not do the will of their people, because the electorate wanted these illegals out. And so their leaders did not do that. So that's one perspective. I think Tucker Carlson said, "Hey, it doesn't matter what you believe or what your ideology is. A woman was killed, and this isn't right. She was, just gunned down, and there doesn't appear to be, the way that it's characterized, it doesn't appear that she was doing an act of terrorism or that she had any intention or that there's any evidence that she was trying to run down these ICE agents. And in fact, the SUV was pointed in the opposite direction. So you get all of this. And then I look, and there's Kristi Noem has gone out to be a part of the ICE raids. And Kristi Noem is who Donald Trump appointed to be the head of Homeland Security. Now, I've mentioned her before, so I didn't want to get too detailed on this, but I had said, I called her Kristi Dog Killer Noem. And you can look into her, boast that she executed a family farm dog, but who wasn't doing its job. But I was looking at the pictures of her there with her flak jacket on and her vest and, looking all tough and everything and saying, to somebody that ICE had rounded up, you're going to pay, you're going to pay for this. And, so I was looking at her and deciding that she needed a new name. And so the name I've given her today is Kristi Botox Head Collagen Lip Dog Killer Noem. It's a mouthful. But that's what you get. You get politics. You get far left in Minnesota and Minneapolis. You've got Homeland Security and ICE descending on this city, doing an operation. And so you've got politics. Now, this evening, I just asked my brother, and what do you think? And he hadn't paid an enormous amount of attention to it, but I live with my younger brother, and he is MAGA, America First, and voted for Trump. So his answer surprised me just a little bit. He said, well, it was just all, the sending in ICE there. He said it was all performative anyway, because Trump had no intention of rounding up illegals. He said this is just theater to take the heat off of him for his forever wars and every insane thing that he's doing. And then in his next breath, he said, have you heard the latest? Have you heard what Trump has said about Greenland? And I said, well, yeah, I've heard that he's been talking about that a lot this week. And he goes, well, he said, the latest thing that he said today is, well, we can't have this. We have got to take over Greenland because we can't let it go to China or Russia. And Trump said, we cannot have Russia as a neighbor. And my brother said, do you know how close Greenland is to us? And I said, well, I don't, but it's not very close. And my brother said, yeah, it's 3,000 miles away. Do you know how close Alaska is to Russia? 53 miles. So he said it's just insane to say we can't have Russia as a neighbor when, hey, we already do. He said, we've already got a military base on Greenland. You want another military base or 2 or 3 or 4 more, but taking it over. And I said, well, you're reminding me that Stephen Miller, I heard Stephen Miller talking this week or read something that he said. It's just crazy. And my brother hadn't heard this, but Stephen Miller is one of Trump's kind of high-level appointees, a top aide. And he said, this is coming out of the New York Times, he asserted on Monday that Greenland rightfully belonged to the United States and that the Trump administration could seize the semi-autonomous Danish territory if it wanted. Nobody's going to fight the United States militarily over the future of Greenland, Mr. Miller told Jake Tapper, the CNN host, after being asked repeatedly whether he would rule out using military force. All right, so this is his quote to Jake Tapper. We live in a world, in the real world, Jake, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power. These are the iron laws of the world since the beginning of time. And I thought, whoa, when I read that, I'm like, that's just crazy. I mean, And yet not. It's crazy honest, because he's telling you like it is for these dogs at the top in a dog-eat-dog world. He went on to say the United States is using its military to secure our interests unapologetically in our hemisphere. Okay? I'm going to repeat that again. The United States is using its military to secure our interests unapologetically in our hemisphere. We're a superpower, and under President Trump, we are going to conduct ourselves as a superpower. It is absurd that we would allow a nation in our backyard to become the supplier of resources to our adversaries, but not to us. Okay, so our neighbor, somebody in our backyard, can't supply resources to our adversaries, say China or Russia or Iran, no. So this is another quote from Stephen Miller. Sovereign countries don't get sovereignty if the U.S. wants their resources. But, Stephen Miller is correct. He is right. And that is their real world. I just loved what unfortunately, I don't remember the exact words. If I would, it would be much cleverer than what I'm about to say. But one of the women in the book club said today about, not spending very much time, if any, on news or news sites or paying attention to the circus, the puppet show, however we want to describe it, that's going on. She said, it's not my thing, not my reality. And I don't remember the word she used. And I said, well, good for you, because that's probably what's keeping you sane. So have a listen to this talk from Alan, who is giving us the bird's eye view once again, and showing us just how long it takes and how many voices are involved in presenting us with the completely false narratives and years-long planted crazy explanations for why we do what we do. It's the drug dealers, it's this, it's that. But you dig a little bit and you'll find it right out of the horse's mouth. At least nowadays you do. Sovereign countries don't get sovereignty if the U.S. wants their resources. So take care. Have a good week, a very excellent week. I'm going to start the new series from Mike in Canada on Thursday, and I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. That's on real history. And I also have a new video from G&G, Tartan Tinker, and that will probably go up tomorrow or Tuesday. I'll space it out. And for those of you in book club, a few offerings there from a couple of the people that are in book club. So thanks again, and take care.
There's a cold silence that we don't dare speak. There's a wall between us and a river so deep. We keep pretending that there's nothing wrong. There's a code of silence and it can't go on.
Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt, and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on the 12th January 2009. For the newcomers, look into cuttingthroughthematrix.com, and on the website there you can download lots of talks I've given in the past, where I try to tie a lot of things together to show you the big picture of what really runs the world, where it's going, and how most people really are manipulated into working along this agenda, which they're entirely oblivious of. Generally, out of good intentions, they work the agenda into being for people they'll never meet, for for an agenda, the true agenda they'll never ever understand, even when it hits them, and they will indeed be in shock. So I think it's over 600 talks I've given, which you can download for free. Also, look into Alan Watt Sentient, sentinel.eu, and you can download written transcripts of these talks, and they're written in the various languages of Europe. And for those who don't have my books yet, you can order them from cuttingthroughthematrix.com. You can also donate, and that keeps me going. And I know things are getting tight out there, because I talk to a lot of people from all over, and people are becoming worried about the economy. And they are right to be worried about it, because it doesn't look so good after all. There's a second bailout package to come, and how many after that, I wonder, until everyone's going to end up in utter slavery to the World Bank, by the looks of it. And because government doesn't have money, it takes money from taxpayers to pay all these bailouts that they're handing out. As I say, there's more to come, and inflation will go rampant and so on. And for those who follow this particular station and others, they'll know all of this. They'll know the scenario. They know the cons are going on, and they know we're in for a rough ride. So we have to hang on and come through it, because after all, we didn't plan it. It certainly was planned, though, and it was helped along and manipulated into existence. Makes you wonder why they hire all these great economists. Why would you hire economists if things like this happen? Why on earth would you do it if it's supposed to be a form of a science? What kind of science is this? And then we have the bottom economists always writing for newspapers, and they're never right on anything. It's quite something, the age in which we live. But over the weekend, I tried to watch a couple of videos. I tried to because I use satellite and for uploading and downloading, and you never get the speed, of course, that you pay for. And especially since the military-industrial complex owns the satellite, I guess we're sharing it with the military, and they get priority. So I can watch some of the videos in little bits and bytes as it stops and starts and so on. And I get the gist of things mainly, and that's about it. But I was watching one by Brian Gerrish, who lives in England, and who started a little movement up to fight and expose a massive organization called Common Purpose. And as I was watching his video, he was going through the fact that this organization was already so enormous. It had basically got members in the military, at the top of the military, members in top police departments, city councils. It was all through Britain. And what struck me was how quickly these things spread because they're so well funded and organized. And I'm going to go into this after the following break, because it's very interesting what I was thinking about. Hi folks, I am Alan Watt. We're cutting through the matrix, discussing a video I watched the weekend made by Brian Gerrish of England, who is an ex-submarine hunter. He was in some kind of frigate that chased the submarines during the Cold War. And he is now campaigning and talking in groups around the country to try and get people interested in combating an organization that has taken off like wildfire, and yet it's so secretive as to its intentions, its motives, and so on. But he goes through the funding that this organization gets and the techniques they use, and the techniques really are very similar, if not the same, as that of the Chatham House. And Chatham House is the head for the Royal Institute of International Affairs, or for International Affairs, where they're allowed to, sometimes they're told what they can tell the public, but they're also told not to mention to the public who said what and what kind of discussion that takes place within the house. I know in the old books of Chatham House, and I have some of them, they used to print the members who attended, and you can often tie in who said what by where they came from. And this common purpose, as I say, gets money from the CFR and different big organizations already. And because it seems to have got such leeway to penetrate into even local government and major government, the federal governments, it has to be related, I think, in some way with intelligence service at the top. Just as the RIIA is also integrated with the intelligence service. In fact, Chatham House was the headquarters during World War II for the British and American OSS. But when I was watching the video, apart from all the discoveries this particular man had found about the organization and its networking and its incredible funding, was that the time the public ever find out about anything that's really important, that's going to affect your lives, especially things which are outside of democracy, it's always, we've been run over already. It's like a stampede that's coming your way and you're in the desert and you see the sandstorm coming and so on. And by the time that you even know what's happening, it's disappearing over the other horizon. And that's how most of these things work. They're so incredibly secretive. They're so heavily financed into existence that they almost can't lose. And part of the purpose of Common Purpose, it seems, is to go for the youth in schools. They recruit teachers as well, who then recruit the children. And that reminded me right off the bat of the techniques used by the Cecil Rhodes Foundation and eventually the Lord Milner group that amalgamated with it. They called the youngsters who were being trained the kindergarten, Milner's kindergarten. So they're going to create new future leaders in all aspects of society. That seems to be their role. And as I say, it's outside of any democratic control. In fact, it's penetrated all of the democratic control. And I'm not surprised, because we're seeing in a new world order. That's what's coming in. We're living through it. And Gorbachev and others have discussed this many, many times, that this coming transitional century, this is the century of change. It means it's a century to bring in this global society, and not just a society where we can continue as we have before, being good consumers and producers and so on, but a controlled society right down to population control, as in partnership with the old Soviet system. In fact, they brought many of the Soviet experts on board to amalgamate the two systems. And again, Professor Carol Quigley talks about that, and so did Norman Dodd of the RIIA Commission. So that's what we're living through today. It's to be a heavily controlled society, which of course must portray itself as something completely different. Whenever anything is sold to the public in politics or in a political fashion, you'll never get the truth, because power is power. I don't care who is bringing in the power, who wants the power. Power is power, and they never tell the public their ultimate goals. And I think that's true in all administrations, probably down through the centuries. And not John Dee, but Francis Bacon said it's best the public never really know the true machinations of government, the true reasons that they do things. But I was also thinking about how on earth did we get here. Studying history gives you an idea, and even history is heavily spun. Ancient history can give us a lot, although it's mixed with mythology, because that's how ancient history was written. History used to be written generally on command of a king or a potentate, and therefore the historian had to be politically correct as he wrote the history. He had to always glorify the king or his lineage or whatever. So you never get a true picture of history. Even ancient pharaohs were known to have lost battles and to have completely lied about the outcomes of the battles and then reversed the reality. This takes me on to culture, really, and culture creation and control. We always think that sometime in the past, and that's what the media often plays on when they give us, especially your mainstream CBC type, BBC plays that they put on, they always give you some sort of glorified past. And they love I don't know why they love just the pre-Victorian age or the Victorian age with the costumery and so on. But they always pick the wealthy classes and give you these stories and so on. And that doesn't tell you any of the truth whatsoever, because the majority of the people did not live like that. So they give us always a nice past to look back on, a fake one. At least for most people it was fake. And why did they do that? Why do they always do that? They're catering to human stress and emotion, because we all want some kind of security and continuity and purpose for living, in fact. And culture generally gives to people, whole tribes, nations, clans, whatever, a reason for being. That is why Darwin himself, when he came out with this origin of species, he said that a superior culture with technology, etc., and what they called civilization, comes in and occupies a country of inferior type, meaning those who are, he calls them fixed societies, those who have not progressed, they're arrested development, you might say. That's what they often call it too. Then those people will lose whatever culture or reason for being that they had, and will often disintegrate or perish through self-abuse. And we do certainly see this with some people who go into alcoholism. And Africa has a lot of drugs in some areas too. But it's a form of wiping oneself off the face of the map. It's self-destructive, because the ideals and principles, which can often be very basic, are being taken from them. And again, reinforced by the predominating new culture that's come in. They'll often try and wipe out the old culture, which further disintegrates the people if they can't adapt, as they say, in Darwinian terminology. So we are much the same too, even in our own cultures, because when you read the communist philosophies, or science as they call it, which are now included in the system of the West, that brought them together a long time ago, because they knew exactly where they were going a long time ago. And that came out in the RIIA Commission with Norman Dodd, that they knew this back in the 1950s. Then people who are older today will have a hard time adapting to the changes that are coming, and that's why they concentrate primarily on the youth. That's a normal strategy of Sovietization. The older ones are called contaminated. They have false ideas of past, etc., false morality, outdated, antiquated, antique, obsolete. And you must go for the youth, who will be the new ones who will come up. In other words, you can brainwash them perfectly. That's what that simply means, brainwashing. Children will believe whatever they're told by the superiors who manage them. And every tyrant in history has used the same techniques of going after the youth. And this brings me into something of the techniques that are used, because, again, I watched another, in broken pieces anyway, a video via satellite, starts and stops, by Adam Curtis. Adam Curtis has done documentaries for quite a few years, and then he was absorbed by the BBC. But during his sort of freelancing time, he churned out documentaries using archived footage, which the BBC and other countries had, to do with the 20th century primarily, and the wars, and how even after World War II, the Nuremberg Trials were opened off by, I think, a 6-hour-long movie, which had been put together by Hollywood, splicing bits of the Nazi propaganda together, all spliced, to ensure that those people on trial were portrayed in the worst light possible. So even that was set off with fiction involved. I mean, it was not all fiction, but when you take anything out of context, you can certainly make a different story once you patch it all together. And we're into the field here of mind control and psychiatry, because this was used to project onto the masses who must believe the official story. We'll be back with more after this message. Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt, and we're cutting through the matrix, discussing techniques of managing the masses and giving them perceptions, the authorized perceptions. And I mentioned this man called Adam Curtis, who studied in Oxford University, who was into the various sciences, behavioral sciences and so on, so he understood, obviously, these techniques, and perhaps that's why he made different documentaries on them, using archived information which wasn't shown to the public before, but there it was. They had it at places like the BBC. And in Nuremberg Trials, they were set up to try and prove to the public that this was a just war. And they tried, and I'll leave the links at the end of the show. They tried to get Goering to admit he was guilty. And of course, Goering had psychopathic qualities. He didn't see right and wrong the same way as anyone else. He saw whatever was functional for the period. But the whole idea was to try and get him to admit that through coercion and lies and deceit, they basically usurped government for their own ends by using a totalitarian form of government over the people. And Goering didn't deny that. He just didn't see anything wrong with it. He said it's the only thing that would work at that time. And of course remember the whole drive for a long, long time, pre-World War II, was to create the system of democracy. This takes me into the second series, another series that Adam Curtis did on this very topic of democracy. But it's called Century of the Self. And it's fascinating, really. Remember, too, that with all exposés, there's a lot omitted. For instance, he never goes into the fact that down through the last 100 years, there have been big organizations like the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the CFR and a host of other, and you get the Trilaterals and many, many other organizations, all working together to bring in their particular global system. And they still use the term democracy, but it's so secretive and so all infiltrating through all systems of government that it's just too big for the average person to manage even in their head. It's so huge because they're heavily funded, have hundreds of departments working on special projects and so on. But it's still worth watching Adam Curtis's series of videos here, going through the techniques that they used. Now, they used, just at the end of World War I, Edward Bernays. Everyone's heard his name. He was the nephew of Freud. And supposedly, we're told, he used Freud's techniques of understanding this vast sea of the unconscious that's in everyone, the vast sea of emotions and thoughts and symbols and so on, to use that on the people to create a form of democracy. And he was hired by President Wilson when he was only about 24, apparently, so we're told. I think there's a lot more to this man myself. But to go over to set up the League of Nations, and went over to France, and they had this amazing big parades and all the rest of it, as really promoting the birth of a new order, world order, even back then, and to bring in democracy. So Edward Bernays, the nephew of Freud, was heavily involved in the setting up of the techniques that would be used for propaganda purposes And he was open about the term initially called propaganda. He wrote a book called Propaganda. It's worth reading, on how to manipulate the masses. And Bernays went on to have an amazing career. And he ended up being a very, very old man. They lived to a long age, these guys who have no particular scruples. And while he was doing all this kind of stuff, the daughter of Freud had basically taken over the budding Institute of Psychiatry. In fact, she was the head person for basically the world's institutes of psychiatry. And her word was law. Whatever she said became law, basically, in psychiatry. And their whole opinion in psychiatry, the end of World War I, between the two wars, was that the general person within the population, the average person, couldn't be trusted to literally make rational decisions on anything. They saw the people as a big mob, basically, the vast mob, who simply reacted on whimsical emotions that all came out of this great unconscious that Freud called it. And this stuff was taken seriously by governments who were always wary of the people they rule over. So Edward Bernays went on to have a career helping politicians make policies, etc., how to market ideas to the public using Freud's techniques. But I think it's beyond Freud, to be honest. I think this man was trained in a much greater depth of understanding, because he appears, as I say, at 24, knowing all this stuff. And supposedly, in his own words, he just read a book by his uncle. I don't believe that at all. I think he was specially trained for his role. And psychiatry became a very powerful tool in helping governments manage its peoples and get policies across. But he also went into marketing at the same time, working for big private clients and big banks like Lehman Brothers. And we'll be back with more of the story after the following break.
You're listening to the Republic Broadcasting Network, because you can handle the truth.
Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt, and we're cutting through the matrix, discussing some videos made by Adam Curtis on the century of self, as they call it, where he talks about Edward Bernays, who, this incredible man, was the supposed genius behind mass marketing and then individual, and actually categorizing different types of people according to what you could basically sell them by understanding their psychology. But he also was an advisor to presidents. And then he was also working at the same time with big banking institutions and Lehman Brothers, who were developing big chains of clothing and appliance outlets across the country. They brought him in to try and find ways to convince the public to stop buying things because they would last long and they were good quality, etc., but to make them want things by using these inhibited or suppressed emotions. So these things would fulfill, they'd be a temporary fill for these suppressed emotions. And again, Edward Bernays, we're told, had this great ability to understand the problem right away and make it work, to find ways around it. He also, at one point, had a client who ran the whole of Guatemala at one point. And it was a big, massive company, a fruit company, mainly bananas. And everybody worked on banana plantations. And his client in the U.S. was upset because a new president had been elected, who was not communist, by the way. He was socialist in the extent that he wanted to share the wealth with the people. And so the company based in the States asked him to fix it in some way or another. Bernays went into action. He went to see Eisenhower, and between them they conspired to convince the public that this man, this president that was elected, was a communist, which they knew he wasn't. And they even set up a movie company to churn out fake news reels on this man to show he was a red menace living next door. And the U.S. taxpayer funded a war with Guatemala. And they went in there and bombed the bejesus out of Guatemala. Then at the end of it, the U.S. put in their own puppet regime. The company was paid Mr. Bernays very well for restoring their big, massive fruit plantations and so on. And the U.S. taxpayer funded the war. But we're not dealing here with just little con men. We're dealing with people who have the psychopathic abilities, who are up at the top. But they also have some kind of knowledge of the sciences, of real psychology, motivational behavior, and so on. And at that time, at that period, people were used to, say, buying things to last for a long time. And he worked on the way to get people to buy the cheaper, shoddy goods and get used to the idea that something that was older was somehow no use. Something that was new was always better. And he was very, very efficient at doing that too. So he was the father, really, of marketing. He was the guru of marketing. And his techniques were swallowed up by all the marketing companies that blossomed throughout not only the States, but all through Europe as well. And they're still used today to run our minds. There isn't a single project put out by any government that doesn't have to go through marketing companies so that they can sell the idea to the public. Now remember, the idea is never to tell you the truth, but to sell you the idea, because we fall for ideas. We like to hear things that elevate us into some great, wonderful future or whatever. We like the terms they use, and they're deliberately picked and chosen for us. And they truly do have society down to a very fine art, because from Bernays too, they came out with focus groups where they would bring people in to test products. A bunch of the observers would stand behind two-way mirrors and watch and record the reactions of people to different products. They targeted initially the women with fashion. In fact, they brought in the miniskirt. This is long before the 60s, because they tried it in the 20s too. They got women to smoke to make it seem that this was a power symbol. Having a cigarette was a power symbol. And so they hired top people at a particular show in New York, I think it was, to suddenly start smoking, and made it very daring to do. And that was picked up immediately by women who saw this, and they started smoking. He did the same thing with getting women to drink different kinds of alcohol. To Bernays, the average person was completely malleable. If you simply observe an individual for long enough, you can find his weak spots or her weak spots, and you can exploit it. And that's the whole process of this is exploitation. All marketing is exploitation. They're trying to sell you something or make you do something, or even change your lifestyle from government wanting you to behave in a different way. This is all done through specific marketing. And then in the 60s, the 1960s, there was a sudden change, they say, and it's in this series that I'm going to put the links up for at the end of the show, where the youth were so sick of the mass marketing culture. And this caused a problem for those at the top, the big salesmen, economists. How do we get this group to buy products? How do we turn them from hippies to people who will actually buy products? And so they studied them. Like any other group, you study them. And eventually they realized that there was a change going on. People wanted more individuality, to be recognized really as individuals. And at the same time, entrepreneurs came out using the same psychological marketing techniques, Delphi techniques and so on, and started teaching groups on motivational behavior therapy. All psychology and psychiatry combined. And that took off like a rocket, with with people who were technically unhappy with their lifestyles, unhappy with life in general, and they wanted to change themselves. So once again, change is good, as they say. And the CIA, of course, were involved heavily in the studies to do with any kind of behavior modification which comes under mind control. In the videos, as I say, the links are put up, you'll see that there was the Esalen Institute, one of the first biggies that tried to alter different people's behavior. They tried to alter black people's behavior in the States by forms of encounter groups, and they weren't too successful, so they tried it on a convent in Los Angeles. And within a few weeks, they had literally, and this they'll tell you on the video, by altering their inhibitions and their common sense on anything, the convent stopped, it just closed its doors after about 6 weeks, because the nuns had all abandoned everything, been told that everything they had was a suppressed emotion, let it go, and they all became lesbians. This is the power of this motivational type behavior modification that people generally pay to get done to them. And those who remember that time remember the roll thing and all the other techniques that they used. And in the video, you'll see people writhing about. You'll see them on the floor. You'll see them kicking their heels on the floor, putting their legs up and down as they're sitting on chairs in rapid motions. These are the same techniques you'll see in what they call the Toronto Blessing, where these con men Christians pretend that the Holy Ghost is coming into people, but you'll see the exact same movements and the writhing and the screams and so on. This used in these motivational behavior therapy lessons. So I'm tying the same technique together, even through certain religions and TV evangelists that do this kind of stuff. I could go into the whole techniques of why it works and how it works, but we don't have time on tonight's show. But, as I say, that was the promotion of the self at that time, trying to create the self, and that's when everything started to come out in the 70s and 80s as your personal. Whatever it was selling, it was a personal item. If you were buying something electronic, it was your personal radio, or it was your even personal photocopier. Now it's personal computer. That's where all that came from, because the big marketers with their experts were studying vast segments of society. And that's why they want data on every single person, so they can market right to you and make you buy something you hadn't thought of. And governments, again, are completely interwoven now with these same behavior modification specialists called marketers. Marketers work for governments. They work in campaigns for elections. They work and they study all opposition, by the way, through their polls, and find ways to overcome that. It's quite fascinating how they do it. But what it shows you is that so many people in today's society are malleable. Now let's go back to the initial concept of this. At the end of World War I, now let's remember, World War I was not created by just ordinary people. It was the heads of governments who declared war on each other. The heads of governments were interwoven at that time with empire building. And you had three main people competing for empire, although Britain had the largest. You also had France and Germany prior to World War I, trying to build up empires, which also meant it's a lucrative business for materials and resources for big owners or big corporation owners who became fabulously rich through the wars. But at the end of World War I, here's the mind bender, because as I say, all the psychiatrists and the Freudian psychiatrists came out and blamed the ordinary people for the wars. And that fixation, that it was all the fault of the common man and woman, has stayed with psychiatry ever since. Charles Galton Darwin and others came out and said that psychiatry and psychiatrists should be on the board of every government to ensure that the politicians were all perfectly sane. Now, what makes the psychiatrists think they're any better? Or reasonable, more reasonable or rational for that matter? And this philosophy held true for a long, long time. But instead, mainly the psychiatrists, what you've got is the next best thing. You have the Bernays types, the marketer types working with government to get them into government, to get parties in, and to manage the people throughout through perception, alteration, or distortion. Not to give truth to the public, but to distort your perceptions on things, on events. The marketers, and in another series done by Adam Curtis too, he shows you these guys working with big politicians, Margaret Thatcher, Bill Clinton, and others. And you'll even hear it said that they had no intention, really, of fulfilling any promises. They just wanted the public to believe that they were changing and going off in a different direction. You'll hear it said by those involved. Life is a stage, isn't it? The world's a stage, and these guys are always playing to the public, but it's never for the public's benefit. But they're still under the same impression that the general public cannot be trusted. If you wonder why we're going into this century with massive observation on every individual, with incredible data keeping on everything that the individual does, with cameras everywhere, IDs being shown, ID cards being shown across Europe and the States and different places. And we know it's not the end of it. The chip is still to come. It's all from this initial idea of those who ruled in the early 20th century, that the people were unstable, irrational, and could not be counted on to make rational decisions. As I say, they were told by people like Freud that the average person was he would just act out unconscious desires and never know why. This tied in, of course, because psychiatry, from its very inception, was completely tied in with eugenics. Utterly. And in fact, there's other videos out there to do with the psychiatrists in Germany, Nazi Germany, and how almost every psychiatrist in Germany became a Nazi party member because the philosophies that Adolf Hitler was pushing were so pretty well identical with their own. The idea being, coupled with Darwinism and Freudism, that in survival of the fittest, that there were inferior types in society, and it also bolstered the ruling elite of the day because they believed themselves, well, we must be the most evolved species at the top, since we are at the top. And because we have this power, and because we have amassed vast fortunes and held on to it through generations, we are obviously the elite, while those below are almost a separate species. And I say that's when it all started. Psychiatry gave credence to this. They backed it up. And there was a fight on, in fact, for psychiatrists to get placed on the boards of all governments of the world. The League of Nations advocated it on various occasions. The United Nations has advocated it at certain times. If you wonder why you see this massive campaign for mental health, where they want everyone to be monitored from birth onwards throughout life, but they're starting with the children, not to spook the adults. It's all to do with this one same single agenda, that those at the top came to conclusions a long time ago, that you cannot make a rational decision. You are a potential criminal. You have the potential to be a criminal. You have the potential to be maladjusted. They will tell you what adjusted means. It's to bring in this Sovietized system that was experimented on in the Soviet Union, been perfected in the West. That's where it's all coming from. But as I say, Adam Curtis does one fatal thing, and he omits through all of this. How come the agenda towards the world governmental system has gone on unimpeded, regardless of what party was ever voted in any country? He doesn't go into the mandates of the bureaucrats and their policies. I'll be back with more after this break. Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt. We're cutting through the matrix, discussing just a little bit about the marketing techniques that have been used for 100 years to alter and shape culture. I said a long time ago that you have to find who you are. The hardest thing is to find who you are in this day and age, because we tend to be composites of all our indoctrinations, a lot of which we're completely oblivious that we've even had. Because culture is controlled and created and updated, not by chance and not just for profit. Profit's a big thing, but it's also done because there is a parallel government that wants to control everyone, and they're bringing us through part of the transition phase, and they have a whole bunch of transition phases as they phase out the old man through transhumanism and bring out the new. And they must sell that idea, which they're doing very well to people. There's a lot of people who emailed me thinking that they deserve to be part cyborg or have longevity. And I always refer back to Bertrand Russell and Aldous Huxley, who mentioned that there are a lot of people who think they will deserve it, but they're not even in the running. Getting back to Bernays, it's astonishing. He's a nephew of Freud, whose daughter Anna ends up being the head for many years, most of her life, of the World Psychiatric Federation. Even the patients she treated, you'll hear this on the video, personally, generally committed suicide. So she really did a great job on them, but that didn't matter because the propaganda of making her famous, because you make stars, including stars in psychiatry and stars in politics and stars anywhere else, they are made by the same industry, the marketing industry. But then you go down through these particular videos and you'll also see, I think it's the great-grandson of Freud, who's married to the daughter of Rupert Murdoch and his big conglomerate chain, and how they changed the media using this younger Freud, using his ideas. He owned a massive marketing company, and how they blended in news with advertising in actual stories themselves. You realize that. They also came up with the idea of putting brand name products in the big movies, etc., and having famous stars mentioning these products at least twice in every interview. Everything is a show, and it's also marketing and selling. Everything. There's nothing real on the big screen or the TV screen. It's all strategy, so that you will perceive things in a certain way. And they also understand what we go through are milestones as a young man or a woman from childhood, and they segregate it all up and mark it right to you, even bypassing the parents. How to bypass parents and make the child get what they want without the parents even being aware that they've given in to the child's demands. Incredible psychology is at play. By using these techniques, they hope to control a world society. But as we go through the initial changes into the world system, we have to go through the totalitarian system and get used to that as well, because that's all part of the training. Every camera on the road is meant to create fear within you. There's always another reason for what you see around you. That's it for tonight. I hear the music coming in, and it's a very short hour because there's so much to say about this. I'll probably say more tomorrow. So from Hamish and myself, is good night, and may your God or your gods go with you.